On an ordinary morning in Nairobi, as vendors sweep dust from the roadside and mothers stretch every shilling to feed their children, a familiar tension hangs in the air. The news plays silently in the background, images of tear gas shouting crowds, collapsing businesses, and exhausted police forces. In living rooms across Kenya, people ask the same questions they've been asking for years. Will a new president fix this? Will 2027 finally bring relief? Some insist that President William Ruto still holds the key to Kenya's future. Others argue the opposite, that only a total political reboot can pull the country out of its spiral. But a different voice has re-entered the national conversation, and it refuses to accept that the crisis facing Kenya is simply political. It is the voice of a woman who predicted long before the 2022 elections that choosing the wrong path would unleash a kind of darkness no ballot box could stop. A woman who says plainly, whether Kenyans keep the current regime or replace it, the next leader will only continue the judgment already at work. To many Americans watching this from afar, the idea of a national judgment may sound distant or dramatic. But to Kenyans living through soaring prices, unexplained violence, and deepening mistrust in institutions, it feels painfully real. And when a nation begins to collapse from within, older generations, those who remember what stability once felt like, start asking a deeper question. What if the real battle is no longer political, but spiritual? What if no election can save a country whose foundations have already shifted? Today's story is not about candidates or parties. It is about a nation wrestling with its soul and a prophet who claims she saw this crisis years before it arrived. If you are someone who believes that leadership requires more than campaign promises, if you care about the future of Kenya and the direction of Africa as a whole, stay with me. And if you're among the first who want to understand the truth behind the headlines, please subscribe and share this video. Your voice helps bring light to stories the world often overlooks. Before her name ever reached national headlines, before millions of Kenyans debated her prophecy, this woman's journey began in a place far more ordinary and far more painful. She speaks openly about it, perhaps because she knows many people assume prophets are born wholly untouched by the weight of human flaws. But her story begins with weakness, with drifting away from the faith of her childhood, and with a long season of wandering. She remembers the years before 2016 as a time when her life felt scattered. She still went to church occasionally, but her heart wasn't anchored. She had surrounded herself with the wrong friends. She drank casually, sometimes more than casually, 1 or 2 beers, as she puts it, though she now admits it was a symptom of deeper restlessness. She loved dancing, staying out late, and losing herself in Nairobi's nightlife. She didn't pretend to be a saint. She was simply a young woman trying to outrun her own emptiness. But one night changed everything. She describes it in detail, even though the memory still shakes her voice. She had been drinking and decided to stop her car somewhere along Thika Road. A man approached someone she had never seen before. He greeted her politely, but the moment he spoke, she felt something shift inside her, as if her spirit were being pulled out of alignment. She didn't understand it then. She still doesn't fully understand it now. Somehow, she let him into her car. Somehow, she drove him into the city. And somehow, she found herself in a club surrounded by unusually young people, with unusually large amounts of money, an atmosphere that felt wrong but difficult to leave. She remembers him taking her phone, adding himself on her social media accounts, and guiding her movements in a way she describes as arresting my spirit. She ended up at his house that night, though she insists nothing physical happened. What terrified her was not what he did, but what she felt, an overwhelming sense of being spiritually trapped. When she returned home the next day, the real battle began. The light bulb in her house had blown out. The room was dark, and the darkness felt alive. She lay down to sleep, but dread washed over her, the kind of dread that feels like death pressing its weight against the soul. She dreamed vividly of the same man and a woman standing over her holding a knife. She woke up choking on fear. For 4 hours she prayed, crying, shaking, pleading for God's protection. She repeated every scripture she knew. She felt something heavy clinging to her chest, as if a presence refused to let go. Finally, she prayed the one prayer that broke through: God, let the covering that protects my spiritual father come over me now. In that moment, she says, the weight lifted, the presence left. She could breathe again. Even her mother didn't fully understand what had happened, but her boss surprisingly did. When she confessed everything at work, he didn't laugh or dismiss her. He told her plainly, you are being introduced into cartism. You must choose who you will serve. Those words cut through her confusion. She realized the path she was on was not neutral. She could no longer live halfway between two worlds. And so in 2016, she made the decision that would define the rest of her life to return to God fully, without hesitation, without compromise. Her return wasn't simple. She began seeing things, hearing things, sensing spiritual realities she didn't know how to explain. It frightened her enough that her family considered sending her to a counselor. But her church leaders recognized what she could not. She was being trained in the prophetic. The visions, the sensitivity, the spiritual attacks, all of it was preparation. From 2016 to 2019, she underwent what she calls intense prophetic training. She learned to distinguish the voice of God from the noise of her own anxiety. She learned to pray not only for herself, but for her nation. And slowly, almost reluctantly, she began to realize that God was shaping her into something she never expected: a national intercessor, someone whose prayers were not just personal, but generational. By the time Kenya approached the 2022 elections, she had been praying for the country for more than a decade. And it was during those long nights of intercession that she claims God showed her what was coming. By the time the 2022 election cycle arrived, Kenya was vibrating with political noise. Churches were openly endorsing candidates. Influential bishops declared divine visions. Prayer rallies became campaign rallies. Everyone had a prophecy, and every prophecy conveniently aligned with political loyalties. But in the middle of that storm, this woman, still relatively unknown, still carrying the weight of her spiritual training, did something she herself admits she did not want to do. She took January of that year, the entire month, and shut herself away in prayer. Midnight prayers, fasting, long hours of silence. She wasn't seeking predictions, she was begging for clarity. She says she had already seen the direction the people and the church were taking, and something in her spirit refused to accept it. "I want to hear the mind of God concerning this land," she told herself. What she claims happened next became the climax of her journey. One afternoon, without a dream, without a vision, without the dramatic experiences she once had, she felt God speak plainly, almost like dictation. 3 candidates, 3 paths, 3 futures. Candidate A, she wrote, was a man. The church did not trust a man seen as hostile to religious institutions. But he was also, she said, the man God had chosen to fulfill his agenda for Kenya, a bridge needed to usher in candidate C. She emphasized one detail repeatedly: candidate C was a David, a man, not a Deborah, a future deputy with a role far greater than the nation realized. Candidate B, however, was the warning. A man who looked like a sheep, lived among the sheep, spoke like a sheep, but was not a sheep. His desire for power, she wrote, has been found wanting before the eyes of the Lord. If he became president, she warned he would stay in power as long as he wishes, delaying Kenya's destiny for years. She wrote everything down. Then she hid it. For 2 weeks, she wrestled like a person holding fire in her bare hands. She knew what the church wanted. She knew which candidate was being hailed as God's choice, complete with posters, prayers, and televised endorsements. And she knew her message contradicted all of it. She tried to ignore the words she felt God had given. But the night before she finally spoke publicly, she felt tormented by the same heaviness that once visited her in that dark room years earlier. She could not sleep. She says the Holy Spirit kept pressing one question into her spirit: "Why are you disobeying me?" So she surrendered. She called a friend, recorded a Facebook Live with only 120 viewers, and uploaded the clip to YouTube quietly, almost reluctantly. And then 2 weeks later, the unimaginable happened. The video exploded across Kenya. Millions watched it. Millions argued about it. Millions attacked her. What followed was not applause. It was backlash. From Christians, from church leaders, from pastors who had already publicly endorsed candidate B, from believers who accused her of being a prophet of doom, a plant of darkness, an enemy of revival, a woman sent to destroy the church. Some mocked her testimony, using her past, her drinking, her dancing, her spiritual battles as evidence she couldn't possibly hear from God. Others insisted she was merely seeking attention, even though she had never been in the spotlight before. A few accused her of being manipulated by political forces, despite offering no names and refusing to endorse any party. Her reaction to all this was startlingly calm. She took a back seat just as the biblical prophet Micaiah once did when he contradicted 400 other prophets and waited for events to unfold. She didn't defend herself. She didn't make counter videos. She simply watched and prayed. But inside her heart, something else was happening. As the church celebrated what it believed was a divine political victory, she felt a very different weight settle over Kenya. A heaviness she recognized, a silence she feared. A darkness she had prayed against for years, and she knew before the first protest broke out, before the first tear gas canister rolled across the streets, before the first economic shock hit the Kenyan people, that the real crisis had not yet begun. Because in her understanding, once a nation rejects what she calls the perfect will of God, the consequences do not stay hidden for long. When the 2022 dust settled and the new administration took office, most Kenyans expected the usual rhythm of political transition, disappointment for some, celebration for others, and eventually a return to everyday life. But what unfolded in the months that followed did not feel routine. It felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened. Prices surged almost overnight. Jobs dried up. Businesses that once seemed stable began collapsing. Mothers who previously worried about school fees now worried about food. And in neighborhoods across Nairobi, a quiet, painful truth settled in: life was getting harder, not better. For this woman of God, none of this was surprising. She had already posted a sobering message on her social media in late 2022: the nation has entered judgment. Many dismissed it at the time, but as Kenya drifted deeper into economic and emotional despair, more people began revisiting her words. She explains judgment in a way that resonates with older listeners, those who have lived long enough to sense when a nation is spiritually off course. Judgment, she says, is not a lightning bolt from heaven. It is the slow withdrawal of divine protection. When a nation chooses disobedience, she believes God allows darkness to operate freely. Oppression increases, wickedness rises, leadership grows blind, institutions lose direction, and ordinary people carry the weight. It did not take long for her description to match the lived experiences of Kenyans on the ground. Families faced soaring fuel and food prices. Hospitals lacked resources. Security deteriorated. Protests erupted across major cities, especially among the younger generation. The streets filled with the anger of Gen Z teenagers and young adults who had never known a Kenya untouched by political turbulence, but who had never before risen in such unified defiance. Church leaders rushed to explain the unrest. Some called it revival, a new spiritual awakening among the youth. But the woman whose 2022 prophecy caused national controversy saw something different entirely. She insisted that God does not ride on sorrow. Revival does not come wrapped in tear gas and bloodshed. In her eyes, the Gen Z uprising was not a divine reform movement. It was the visible expression of a nation under spiritual siege, young people crying out because the spiritual foundation of Kenya had been compromised. And she did not hesitate to identify where the responsibility fell. Not on State House, not on Parliament, not even on the President. It fell, she said, squarely on the shoulders of the church. She repeated it again and again. The reason Kenya is where it is today is because of the priests who misled the flock. To her, the pastors who endorsed the wrong direction in 2022 did not merely make a political mistake, they opened a spiritual breach. And the consequences flowed into every home and every village. The civil consequences soon intertwined with political ones. Confidence in national leadership plunged. Voices calling for regime change grew louder. The narrative of betrayal, economic betrayal, political betrayal, generational betrayal spread rapidly. In central Kenya, especially the Mount Kenya region, the pain felt sharper. According to her prophetic insight, this region was drinking 2 cups its own territorial judgment and the national one layered on top. Whether one agreed with her or not, it was undeniable that Mount Kenya, once the economic anchor of the nation, was experiencing unprecedented strain. Meanwhile, political analysts insisted that removing the current administration would solve everything. But she countered forcefully: whether people maintain the current regime or they choose another leader, the leader they will choose will come to continue the judgment. Because for her, the root of the crisis was spiritual disalignment, not political mismanagement. And until the spiritual foundation was repaired, until the church repented, until the nation turned back to God, the suffering in her eyes would continue. Elections might change faces, but judgment would change nothing. From the outside, especially from living rooms in the United States, Kenya's turmoil may appear like just another episode in a long series of African political struggles, something unfortunate but distant. American audiences are accustomed to hearing familiar headlines: election disputes, youth protests, rising fuel prices, IMF pressure. But what many Americans miss is the deeper question beneath those headlines, the question this Kenyan prophet raises so boldly: what happens when a nation's crisis is not merely political but spiritual? This is not a framework Western analysts often use. In Washington, policy debates revolve around governance, economic reform, security partnerships, and counterterrorism. At think tanks in DC, experts evaluate African nations through metrics: GDP growth, debt-to-income ratios, trade balances, election integrity indexes. But what if the numbers cannot capture the real fracture? What if the unrest shaking Kenya in 2023 and 2024 is the symptom of something far older, deeper, and more dangerous? To many older Americans watching this unfold, her explanation may feel familiar. It echoes periods in U.S. history when people believed America itself was under judgment during the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights era, and after national tragedies. Even if one does not share her theology, the idea that moral and spiritual decay can weaken a nation is something many in the American senior generation understand instinctively. And Kenya is not alone in facing this question. Across Africa, nations are grappling with institutional fatigue, generational anger, and the exhausting weight of foreign influence. Western governments, including the U.S., often view African politics as a chessboard: strategic alliances, mineral access countering China, maintaining stability. But for millions of Africans, the question is not geopolitics. It is survival. What they want, what they are demanding, is not another election cycle, but a transformation of the soul of their nations. This is why Kenya's story quietly intersects with another powerful narrative unfolding on the continent: the rise of leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose bold rhetoric about sovereignty, dignity, and national rebirth has captured attention far beyond Africa's borders. Americans over 60 may recognize echoes of past revolutionaries' leaders who insisted that true change requires more than new policies. It requires a new mindset, a new moral core. Traoré's actions reclaiming natural resources, challenging foreign interference, elevating youth, and rebuilding civic pride stand in stark contrast to Kenya's internal spiritual conflict. While Kenya wrestles with a judgment the prophet believes was triggered by a compromised church, Burkina Faso presents a different kind of struggle, an attempt to break free from decades of dependency and external manipulation. For U.S. policymakers, this contrast raises difficult but necessary questions. Why do some African nations collapse under spiritual and political weight, while others ignite movements of self-determination? Can elections truly fix what has been broken by decades of moral compromise, whether in Kenya, America, or anywhere else? And what role should the U.S. play in regions where the crisis is not only institutional but existential? Most importantly, for older American viewers who have watched nations rise and fall, the prophet's message may resonate on a personal level. When a country loses its spiritual foundation, whether that foundation is faith, moral clarity, or shared values, no administration can rescue it on its own. From Kenya's turmoil to Burkina Faso's awakening, Africa is forcing the world to confront a truth long ignored: political change without spiritual transformation is an illusion. As Kenya stands at a crossroads, the weight of the prophet's warning falls heavily across the land. She does not speak like a political commentator or an activist. She speaks as someone who believes she has watched her country step into a storm of its own making. And whether one believes her theology or not, her message carries a sobering truth: a nation cannot outrun the consequences of its spiritual choices. Her warning echoes across every county, from the farmlands of Rift Valley to the bustling neighborhoods of Nairobi. If the judgment is not lifted, no election will save this country. Not the current administration, not the next administration, not even the most charismatic candidate in 2027, because judgment, as she describes it, is not a political event. It is a condition of the soul of a nation, a fracture that spreads through families, institutions, and generations. And before a nation can heal, it must confront the truth of what it has allowed, what it has encouraged, and what it has ignored. For Kenya, that reckoning begins with the church, the priests who misled their congregations, the spiritual leaders who traded their moral authority for political comfort, the believers who were swept up in excitement rather than discernment. Her closing message is not one of despair, but of responsibility. She insists there is still hope, real hope, not the kind printed on campaign posters. Hope rooted in repentance. Hope restored by humility. Hope renewed when a nation turns back toward the values it once held sacred. But she also offers a warning for the future. The window for change is not endless. If Kenya continues down its current path, confusing political noise for divine direction, the cost will be borne by the children and grandchildren of those living today. Nations are not rebuilt overnight, but they can fall in a single generation. And once a generation loses faith that a better future is possible, reclaiming that future becomes the greatest battle of all. For viewers in the United States and across the world, Kenya's crisis raises a deeper global question. What keeps a nation standing when its institutions crack and its leaders fail? Some point to economics, others to elections. But throughout Africa, from the turbulent streets of Nairobi to the rising confidence of Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, many are beginning to argue that the true battle is spiritual long before it becomes political. So, let me leave you with this. Do you believe Kenya can rise again if it does not first repair its spiritual foundations? And if nations cannot heal from the outside, in what must truly change inside the heart of a people? If this conversation opened your eyes to the deeper story behind Africa's headlines, please share this video. And if you believe that truth, real truth, matters more than trending narratives, then subscribe. You may be among the first standing with those who seek justice, clarity, and hope for Africa's future.